Hello, welcome to Alaska Book Week 2025 and to the panel, which is insightfully entitled Historians Share Secrets of Historical Research. I'm David Ramseur, president of the Alaska Historical Society, and I'll serve as a moderator of sorts for this panel. I'm happy to have three other members of the society with us, including two other board members. And what we also have in common is that each of us has published a relatively recent historical nonfiction book. So our plan today is a casual conversation about how to do historical research, maybe some tricks of the trade, and a little talk about the unique challenges of marketing books about history. So with that, I'll ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, give a bit of your history background, and then tell us a little about your recent book. And why don't we start up in the far north with Tyler Kirk from Fairbanks?
Thank you for the honor of the invitation, David. I'm really happy to be here. My name's Tyler Kirk, and I am associate professor and the Arthur Fathauer Chair in History at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm a historian of Russia, the Soviet Union, and the circumpolar North. Um, and my book, After the Gulag, A History of Memory in Russia's Far North, was published by Indiana University Press in December 2023. Um, so that's me.
Okay, let's head south to Sitka, Rebecca Poulson.
Hi, yeah, I'm Rebecca Poulson, and I have been doing historical research, just kind of falling into it with oral history. So I was really curious about the story of Sheldon Jackson College's failure, and that led back and back and back, and um, found so much stuff that was that kind of contradicted the usual narrative down here that we published a book called Sitka, Alaska, A Short History. But I'm working on a book about Sheldon Jackson School and Alaska history.
And then into the heartland of Alaska. How about Ian in Anchorage?
Yeah, thanks, David. Good to see you all. My name is Ian Hartman. I am a professor of history here at UAA and associate dean of faculty in the colleges of arts and sciences. I guess my most recent book was a co-written volume with David Reamer on Black history in Alaska, and then just prior to that, there was an earlier volume that I authored through the National Park Service on the same topic, but I've also done some editing of a more extensive collection on Anchorage and an earlier book on race and public policy in the American South. And so these days I'm also doing some exhibits, but it's book week, so we'll keep it the books.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
And I'll do a brief introduction of myself as well. I came up to Alaska in '79 as a reporter for the Newsminer up in Fairbanks. Did that for about 10 years and went to the dark side and worked in politics. And when I was working for Alaska Governor Cooper in the mid 1980s, Alaska and Russia started opening up after the Cold War. And I got involved with that and actually caught the Russian bug, had been to Russia about a dozen times, and wrote a book in which was published in 2017 by University of Alaska Press called Melting the Ice Curtain. And it's about the ramp up of Alaska-Russia relations, the good times and the bad times. And so I've been talking about that on the circuit as well. So why don't we talk a little bit about the earliest stages of how you tackle a history book? I was thinking about my own project. What assessment did you make about available sources? How would you access those sources? Were there any challenges, unique challenges, given that your subject is historical and not necessarily contemporary? So if anybody wants to jump into that.
Or should we just rotate the way we
Sure.
did?
Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, I guess I'll start. So I started my book project. It began, it had many lives, but it began as my doctoral dissertation. And so I started I mean, I've been going to Russia. I had been going to Russia for many years, and particularly the Russian far north. And I really identified sources just by going to the archives, right? I did what historians do typically, and I studied the historical literature, and I really wanted to explore the lives of former prisoners who had been sent to Stalin's forced labor camps, commonly known as the Gulag. Um, but my access to sources, and maybe this is jumping the gun, to one of the other questions that David sent us, cha my access to archival sources really changed after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And I can talk more about that later. But I really started by going to the archives and even working with local historians in the Komi Republic, where I did my research, to identify sources that I could access, and that actually led to a wonderful non-linear path towards the book I produced, which was based upon alternate archives that the people who had borne the brunt of Stalinist repression created with their own lives when they donated their personal archives to non-state entities. And so that was kind of became the basis of the book. So yeah, making trips to remote regions and remote places, I guess is the easy answer. Libraries, working with librarians and other archivists. It's kind of how it really got going. I mean, nothing is achieved alone by anyone, I think, in the historical world. But that's I guess the beginning of my story to kick it off to um, Rebecca.
Yeah. So I started with oral history interviews and then over the years, because I've been kind of working on this since like 2014 or 2015 and just tackling one chapter, one subject like each year for presentations at the Alaska Historical Society. So each year I'll have a different historical focus. And then a really good source is endnotes of books on the topic, as far as like pointing you to, archives and sources and where things are. And then when I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to look at the Army stuff from Sitka, um, I just happened to have found a dissertation that someone had done in the 70s that was much, I mean, I think he read every single document that was there, and and that was a much better guide than what they had there. Um, yeah, and then going to an archive um where you want to know exactly what you want, you can get, the finding aid like from the institution, and to know ahead of time, like when you go there, what you want to pull. And this is probably like really obvious to you guys, but this, as a newbie, this is like you know what I mean? This is fresh. Um, and then when you go, like I usually take photographs, just because you have limited time there. Um, and yeah, and then keep track, kind of keep a photo log, and then also like note like things that are really cool, that you want to go back to. And then the other things for, like 19th century Alaska stuff is the congressional serial set, and more of that is online. So it's like every document made for Congress, and people have been fascinated with Alaska for a long time. And there's a lot of reports that have just, really great material. And then the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Um, and then Juneau. There's a lot of great stuff in Juneau in the archives and the library historical collection. But yeah, just that strategy of like using endnotes in books to kind of find out where things are, and also other books that you can get, and then yeah, knowing exactly what you want to pull, and then keeping track as you're taking photos, so you're not like like, wow, all these pictures. Anyway, and I found a little digital camera is good. I know people like use phones, but I like a little digital camera. Then you can set like how the what do you call it, the how big the files are. Anyway, secrets.
Ian?
Yeah, so I like Tyler, I came through the, the traditional academic route vis-a-vis a PhD program. And so I will assume that my doctoral advisors are not going to hear what I'm about to say. I was on a year of research, actually probably closer to two, and that involved a number of trips in my case for the dissertation, which evolved into the first book. The topic, such as it was, required trips to the University of North Carolina, the University of Virginia, SUNY Albany, Washington, D.C. And so I was living in Washington, D.C., mostly working out of the National Archives for the better part of my dissertation research year that I had on fellowship. And I got almost nothing done. There were reasons for that, but I thought I was getting something done at the time. But I think that the takeaway is historical research is oftentimes one blind alley after the next. And so I came back with very little usable research. I came back with a lot of stuff, but not very much usable research. And so um, I mellowed out a little bit and tried to plot strategy and drafted a few chapters. And long story short, I I didn't have a lot of information that I maybe thought was going to be useful. It just turned out not to be useful. A lot was on the shop floor, so to speak. And so the last couple of months of before my defense, I had a really, really productive research trip that took me up the East Coast, where I probably did 80% of my research of my dissertation research in that chunk of time. And so, the joke that I'll sometimes make is that you may be researching a topic for a year or two and end up with maybe this much information. You may hit like a really productive patch where you just, it's a couple weeks and you just hit it hard and you find a whole lot of stuff. And that was kind of my experience coming out of my doctoral program. I think I just required a level of experience that I didn't have early on in the process. And so eventually I learned, and I think I became a little bit of a better researcher. I asked a little bit more focused questions. I figured out how I wanted to make better use of the archives. And by the time, my research was complete and I could start to really write the dissertation and then eventually revise the book, I think I had come pretty much full circle. And so that was the first project. What's interesting about that was I was very self-conscious about wanting to write history where all of my subjects and all of the people I was dealing with were dead. I did not have any interest in oral history. I didn't have any interest in talking up to people who may have lived through something. And so, my that that project was basically confined to about the 1860s and 70s through maybe about the 1960s. It was a pretty broad, wide-ranging project, but nonetheless, it didn't really take me down the route of, say, oral history and real contemporary study. And so when I came to Alaska and developed a bit of a second research agenda, I found myself doing the precise thing I said I would never do, which is oral history. And so my most recent work has been extremely community focused, and it's been extremely rooted in oral histories and going out to the coffee shops with people and hearing what they have to say and documenting it and crafting narratives around people who are quite active in the community. And it's been amazing. It's been so rewarding. And I would have never thought that in my PhD program that would have been the right turn that I took. And I'm grateful for it. And so I mean it's brought me into contact with some amazing community elders, some people who have like lived some incredible history. And so I think my plug for Alaska history specifically is that because we are such a young state, because we are a state that frankly hasn't had all that many active historians working on any number of topics, there are wide open lanes. And so I always encourage people to just, sit down and talk to folks who have come through the last 20, 30, 40, 60, 70 years, whatever it is. I mean, these folks are in our community and they have amazing stories to tell. And so I find myself these days just having become quite invested in talking with folks and doing the oral history and crafting, narratives that really have not been brought to the academic foreground. And so that's a truncated version of my, 20-year academic journey, but it gives you a little bit of an idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, I had a sort of non-traditional way of getting into this project. I was in the middle of the governor's office, and we did an initial trip to Russia, one-day trip in 1988. And I was so inspired by it, I figured, maybe there's some historical value to this. And so at that point, I started collecting government documents, briefing papers for the governor, news clips, agreements that were signed between Alaska cities and Russian cities, and news clips. And I continued a bit of a pack rat. And so I assembled all that stuff for about 30 years until I officially retired. And then I decided, yeah, maybe there is a book project in that. So I produced a book outline. One of the things that was particularly valuable for me is I wasn't on faculty anywhere. So I established a relationship with the UAA library. So I had access to library materials, which was affordable and easy. I did trips to archives in Washington, D.C., like Rebecca, and to the Reagan Library because Reagan and Gorbachev met several times and dealt with Russia stuff. One of the frustrations I had was on the records from our congressional delegation. Both Senators Murkowski and Stevens were involved in the early Russian Alaska activities, and both of them have amassed just thousands of boxes of material, but they're not available. They're not either not organized or not available. And so they were of virtually no use to me, and that was a great frustration. I wanted to follow up on the oral history mention that several people had. How did you deal with interviews that you did? Did you transcribe them? Did you hire somebody to transcribe them? In Tyler's case, I assume you speak good enough Russian to be able to have conversations with folks. Can you talk a bit about how you just processed and prepared all that for use in your book?
Yeah, I did both the archival route and the oral history route. I guess a little bit about that before I kind of really directly answer your question, David, is that yes, I do speak Russian and read it. So I learned Russian before I got to grad school, and then obviously through the course of doing this research and then living in Russia as a Fulbright scholar in 2016, 2017, kind of perfected it. So languages are really important to historians who want to work on topics, even Alaskan topics, right? Like, Russian language is really important to Alaska history. So are indigenous languages, and so languages are like part of the historian's toolbox. And our studies of history are often limited by what languages we know and don't. But I the archival kind of shift for me and the challenges that I had, brought me to I followed the trail of breadcrumbs out of the archive to the archives of local history museums in the Komi Republic and civil society organizations that used to exist in Russia, had archives that contain the letters and artwork and diaries and just the things that human beings collect over a lifetime, that they intentionally donated um, to these organizations and to non-state archives because they didn't belong to the state. The state had repressed them, and so they didn't want them to go there. That also led me to interview these people. I mean, by the time I was interviewing, um, doing oral histories with Gulag survivors and mostly their children. They were quite elderly, right? These are people who had experienced great traumas in their lives, and were quite elderly when I interviewed them. One Gulag survivor in Moscow tested my Russian. She's like, okay, I'll talk to you if your Russian's good enough to understand the directions I'm about to give you, and you can find my house. And when I showed up at her door, she goes, okay, let's have a conversation. Um, and so there was a lot of that, kind of like not hazing, but initiation. But I became a member of these communities through, years of kind of almost anthropological field work in that way. And then, did I transcribe my interviews? I did not transcribe them in their entirety because I'd often sit down with people at the kitchen table, the traditional, like kind of Soviet Russian style, and I would sit with them for hours. I mean, and they would lead me on these journeys through their memories and storytelling that would often be totally off topic. And then once they felt comfortable and come back to it, they would share these kind of really profound insights that were like just totally fascinating. So yes, I did some transcription, but no, it did not transcribe everything. And I would spend a lot of time just listening and taking occasional notes when I was with them, and then I'd go home, listen to the whole thing, take extensive notes, like with timestamps, and transcribe those things. Um, so that was just kind of my process. But it was the I think the best way to work with these people who had reason to be distrustful of outsiders to I guess kind of give you a roundabout answer to your question.
Ian, how did you deal with your oral histories?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would mention, and well, we're all historians on this panel, but it'd be interesting to hear like from an anthropologist or from someone from maybe another discipline. But my take on oral history through the discipline is that, the American Historical Society, the professional societies actually don't have much governing how oral history is supposed to work. And so it does actually become a choose your own adventure. And so I think that requires, and I think Tyler said it really well. I mean, it oftentimes is sitting at a table with someone, just hearing their story, knowing again that much of what they say is not necessarily going to end up in your book. It's oftentimes building a relationship, building trust, communicating with them over and over again, really trying to understand their experience. And maybe you end up with a quote or two or three in some kind of a publication after having spent hours and hours with some of these folks. And so I think just being prepared for being a real self-starter and knowing that the profession doesn't necessarily give you strong guidance in how to do this. And so, for me, this usually would manifest itself in a simple email inviting someone out to coffee where maybe, I get a little bit of a sense of who they are as a person, a bit about their story, their comfort level, right? Some people may not want to share a story for one reason or another, or certainly they may not want it to be published. And you certainly have to honor that, I think, going into those discussions that, you may have a really rich conversation with someone, but ultimately their insights may never see the light of day precisely because they're meaningful to that person and they don't want it to be shared broadly. And so, that's one of the things that I think we all have to be prepared for. When the time is right, if the time is right, I do like to record a conversation or two. If they say something maybe over coffee or over the phone that is particularly intriguing to me, I may invite them to do a follow-up where I'm obviously, consciously going to tape a discussion or dictate something where I actually do have some quotes for them that I could share in a publication. So I think it really depends on who you're talking about, the context of the topic, and the comfort level that the person may or may not have in sharing their story. And those all have to be navigated almost on a person by person basis.
In my case, I did about 100 interviews for my book, everything from 15 minutes just to nail down a couple of facts to a couple of hours. I recorded most of them, and then I hired just a friend to do the transcriptions for me because it was so time consuming. And it was sort of funny because she had no connection to Russia. So these Russian terms, place names, they would come back as gibberish, and I'd have to figure out, well, what are we talking about here? So, and I did a number of interviews with Russian officials, and my Russian's nowhere near as good as Tyler's. So what I would do would be to draft questions, have them translated into Russian by a Russian interpreter that I hired, communicate those to the person I wanted to interview. They would send it back in Russian, and then I'd have it translated into English. Sort of a roundabout way to do it, but it turned out fairly successful. How about you, Rebecca? Any oral histories?
Yeah, because actually with the Sitka Maritime Heritage Society, we we did like oral histories, like very intentional, and we have like an annual meeting that's just live oral history. And so I went to, actually it was Will Schneider was very helpful, and there are guidelines for oral history that I don't know if they're in the historian world, but there are, very just about just the the ethics of it, how you do it, how you treat the person. And because a lot of the times when, like when you're doing oral history, it's, like we're a member of a much more powerful group than the people that we're interviewing. And it's so powerful. It's just such an incredible relationship when you have especially an elder person who is entrusting their story, the story of their life, the way they want it to be remembered to you. It's like this gift, that's also a responsibility. And yeah, all of that, making sure that you are worthy of that trust, that you're not sharing things that don't want to be shared, because that's, and that's something too, they'll, you know, I mean, we probably all had that experience, like where, turn off the recorder, I'm going to tell you something. And it's not necessarily, like what you would, like use in print, but it's that, like understanding people's stories and that lived history, I think is really important for connecting, um, putting history into that whole, continuum, of how, things 100 years ago made life different for, people 50 years ago. And now, like, even if you don't put in, that particular story, like that helps you understand, what life was like.
Did anybody encounter any sort of roadblocks accessing material, either from government officials, people didn't want to talk to you? And if so, how did you get around that? Did you just live without it? Did you find a way around it?
I'll jump in. Yes, always. And maybe this is a bigger philosophical discussion that we may or may not have time for, but this to me is what you're speaking to, David, is exactly why I consider history a humanity and not so much a social science, because we are always working with the sources that we have access to, and we are always crafting narratives based upon either a self-selected set of evidence or evidence that is impartial or evidence that is incomplete. And so, you're going to encounter roadblocks. It's like an inevitable part of the historical research process. And so then the question becomes, how do you craft your narrative in light of those roadblocks and in light of those obstacles? Because then it is up to the historian to make a series of decisions, right? That is going to necessarily change the direction of the story that she or he is telling. And so I could give you examples, but I'll defer to the other two panelists. But just to kind of jump in and say that I think it's safe to say that all of us have probably encountered a moment when we're looking for access to a certain collection or a certain person or whatever it is, and we don't get it for one reason or another. And then as a result, we have to make a very deliberate decision to reconnoiter and basically adjust the narrative accordingly.
Tyler, I'm surprised you didn't end up in the gulag yourself.
Yeah, there are a couple of close calls. No, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, with what Ian said, I think that it's in the subtitle of my book. I said a history of memory in the Russian far north, because my access changed very much, like before Russia invaded Crimea and after Russia invaded Crimea, and then like subsequent trips and interactions with people. I mean, it's now difficult, maybe even unethical to put somebody in the position of like writing to them now, because they have to report contacts with foreigners. I mean, it's just the level of repressiveness that I dealt with over time changed. And so the rules of the game and archival access were always changing. But that's why it led me to like this alternate history, right, of the Soviet Union, and archives outside of the state. And the term I love to teach my students or and anybody that's interested in history is that we always are building on and moving beyond the work of others. And so that means like we always have different access. It's not in an ideal world, it would be, you know, universal and somebody could go and duplicate, and I hope they can someday, the work that I did, right? Yeah, I mean, I had documents that I had scanned or taken pictures of the first time I started working on this topic. And then when I went back, the archivist was like, "Oh, you can't look at that." And I was like, "Well, see, I just got it right here on my phone." I'm like, put that away. Um, and so, yeah, it was always really interesting. Like the head of the archives, when I went back, the state, let me say, the state archive in the Komi Republic had been a former state security officer and not an archivist, and so that would presented new challenges too. Um, yeah, I was always navigating this like political sensitivity with my topic. Um, but it was also interesting in that the history of, forced labor in the Gulag and sort of its commemoration in the region that I was working in was all very well known. It was a history that people had because of the 80s, right? Gorbachev's opening up of this conversation about, Stalin's repressions, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a history that is part of the region's identity. Um, and so the access or lack thereof was always really interesting to me. And one more anecdote, I went to this kind of history week like we're having right now. But we're talking about books, but I went to the archives and they had laid out on the table in the middle of the room, the reading room, all of these police records that I could not have access to as a historian, like case files on former prisoners. And the archivist said to me, "Take a good look because you're never going to see these again." And I just was like, "Oh, that's really interesting. Like, why are you?" They were showing them to students and myself as a professional historian, some other professional historians in the room that were like, "These are the types of documents we have, but they're restricted." Um, and so, our narratives are always shaped by what we can and cannot say on the basis of evidence. And so I'm sure there's rooms of information out there, whether it's in Russia or in Washington or somewhere in Alaska, that we just don't have access to. And if we don't have access to it, we can't write about it. So yeah, I have many more stories about misadventures, but I'll kick it back to Rebecca, and David to share your also trials and tribulations.
Yeah, the stuff that I haven't been able to access is, because there's a lawsuit that prevents them from talking about it. And then the thing of it is like Presbyterians didn't hold on to a lot of stuff. And so a lot of stuff's just gone. It just doesn't exist. But other than that, it hasn't been hard. It's kind of under the radar, I guess.
One of my greatest frustrations was in the late 1980s, a couple of Russian journalists came to Alaska and sort of falsified their credentials and asked for asylum. And these guys sort of blew up all the goodwill in Alaska-Russia relations, ultimately were granted political asylum in Alaska and spent maybe a couple of weeks hanging around Anchorage and then disappeared. And I've never been able to find out what happened to these guys. I've tried to get it from the FBI and other government sources, but it's just been sealed shut. And I sort of lack the skills to use Russian Facebook and other sources to try to chase them down if they went back to Russia. But That's one of the great mysteries of this era that continues to haunt me to a certain extent. So I was gonna, if we've sort of talked about research, maybe focus a little bit about marketing and writing the book, unless anybody wants to make any more research points here.
I would just add one more point. I talked about the negative. I do want to say one positive thing. There were a lot of librarians and archivists and human rights activists who helped me pivot whenever I felt stuck. And I just wanted to give them a shout out because the book wouldn't have happened without them. I would tell them the stories about what I'd run into, and it's no shade on the archivists either that in the state archives. Like they want to keep their jobs and their pensions. Like I get it. So there there are for all of us, I would assume, but especially the Russianists, there are topics that you can do even when you run into official taboos. But I'd be happy to talk more about marketing too. I just wanted
Okay.
to throw that out there.
Yeah, and then I had like a the unique challenges with historical research, and that would be longhand.
Seconded.
And especially like copies of copies and people with unduly fancy handwriting. But
And did you sort that out yourself, or were there anybody you could turn to for help?
I just have a lot of pictures. Like I took a lot of pictures of the army documents, and they were all longhand, and so some of them, I haven't really, like, I haven't, gone to the trouble of trying to figure out what they all say, but yeah,
Oh.
it would have been much nicer if they had a typewriter up here.
So as we sort of steer towards marketing, as everybody was preparing their books, did you try to hang them on any sort of anniversary or milestone that was coming up for marketing purposes? Did you work with your publisher on that, or did you just produce your book on when it was ready?
I just produced mine when it was ready. I also had the benefit of, as I was getting it ready, Putin banned, or the Russian Supreme Court um, made illegal one of Russia's oldest human rights organizations that I had worked really closely with. So it kind of provided like an amazing example of why the history that I just finished was super important. Um, and things just keep getting worse, so it becomes more and more relevant all the time. So no, I was not writing to an anniversary, but I think that like framing it as important to current events even before those things happened was one of the ways in which I drew people's attention to a topic, the politics of memory in post-Soviet Russia, right? In historical narratives and erasing history and things like that, that would be interesting to people who are interested in, authoritarianism and transitional justice, and maybe not necessarily going to pick up a book on Gulag survivors.
Ian or Rebecca, any hooks?
I'm arguably the world's worst marketer. I am really well, I'm both poor at it and I'm uninterested in doing it, which is probably to the detriment of my career. I get that, but nonetheless, it is not something that I have historically been very active in doing. So but that said, I see the value in it, and I think it's interesting because we live in an era now where there is so much competition for information and for people's attention and everything else. And so I mean, it's tricky because as historians, we work on these projects and we immerse ourselves in the archives or in oral histories or wherever we may be, and then we live in front of our screens, typing everything up and trying to get the narrative straight, and then we publish. And yet, how many people read some of the books? It's really challenging for me to think about, particularly my first book. The joke that I make is I'm fairly convinced that book has been read by maybe 20 people in graduate seminar somewhere in like the Southeast. I don't know, but um But that said, to your other question about writing to anniversaries and commemorations and everything, I think that the one time that I did do that quite explicitly was with the Anchorage Centennial, in 1915 to 2015, 2016, basically. And so we had a grant to do a big commemorative edition that was eventually published by the University of Alaska Press, since rolled into the University Press of Colorado. But I have to say that was a lot of fun because it made my life much easier in terms of the marketing aspect, because there was already a lot of interest in it, and there was a lot of I think a lot of people knew about the project because of Anchorage commemorating its 100 years of settlement as it corresponded to the Alaska Railroad. To be clear, there are obviously native peoples in the area long before that. But I think there was a real value in, to the extent that it's possible, trying to connect one's research to maybe a bigger commemoration, right? And so right now we're obviously coming up on the but the 250th, right? And so I think there seems to be a lot of interest in history that is connected to the 250th. Whether or not that interest is always well placed is maybe another topic of discussion, but I do see the value in not necessarily framing a research agenda around an anniversary, a commemoration, a celebration, but to the extent that you're able to do that and it grabs people's interests and pulls them in, I think is actually a really good thing for the discipline, and I certainly support it.
Rebecca, any
Um,
marketing tips?
yeah, I definitely don't have marketing tips, but yeah, so our little history book, a short history of Sitka, Alaska, it it was really a like a pressure relief valve, because like as I was learning more and more about, the history of Alaska, and finding more and more about how it completely contradicts our narrative of Alaska history. And and so and so it was one of those things, where, somebody would say something and I'd be like, well, actually, and so that was, like why that little book, because it was longer than I could than I could explain standing in the doorway. But and I feel like that book, and then also what I want to do with the SJ book, is part of a movement. Like I just got Rediscovery of America, but it's a lot of people like looking at United States history, incorporating Indigenous history, and not, so that Indigenous history is part of it, and not like, oh yeah, they all died or whatever. And so that's where I feel like it's, part of a moment, like especially since 2020, it's just like, oh yeah, the our history wasn't so um one-sided. It wasn't just this one little group of people doing things. And then as far as marketing, I actually don't want to market it as a straight history book. I want it to be more like a um something that, and then going back to, there was a question we didn't talk about, was did we consult with other historians or researchers on how to proceed? And that reminded me that my background is my undergraduate degree was in biology. And so it's drilled into me not to write anything that you can't back up. And I think that's super important um, in writing in general. Like if you're writing about historical subjects or whatever, is to have it just rock solid, like you have a reason for saying everything that you write. Um, and so I do want it to be, as accurate as I can, but I want it to be more of a popular book than a history book. Then I don't want it to be like in the monograph space, but to be, more like, like Boys in the Boat or The Wager, that type of a space. And so, and that's the thing too, like I'm not an academic, so um, it wouldn't do me any good to, to not sell some. And so like I'm working right now on a proposal that I don't even have it published or anything yet, but looking at a more You're not an academic press.
In my case, the 150th anniversary of the U.S. purchase of Alaska was in 2017, and I was about 3 years out from that when I started my project. And I figured, hey, I can punch out this book in about a year or so, and I dramatically underestimated the time it was going to take. I barely made it. I got my book out in the middle of 2017, so I was able to capitalize on that event. And there was a fair amount of just general press and discussion about the purchase. And so I think that helped a little bit too. And I guess the other thing I would mention is some of my most successful book sales came speaking to groups around Alaska, particularly Rotary clubs, because they were big in setting up Rotary clubs in Russia. And every week they've got to have a guest speaker at their Rotary meetings. So I spoke to virtually every Rotary club in the state. And every time I spoke, I sold half a dozen books or something. So it added up. And so that might be a tip for some future historian trying to get a book out the door. Maybe we can head towards a wrap up here. Are there any sort of broad lessons you learned from your book writing process that you would like to share? Anything that you would do differently? Any crazy stories that you want to mention that might be useful?
I have lots of crazy stories, but maybe that would be best for another time when we have more time. I guess the biggest thing that I'm working on two new projects right now, and so what I'm trying to do is like having already passed through the first gauntlet of getting the first book out, I'm trying to just remain cognizant and open to the fact that all of history is contingent, right? And follow sources where they take me, where they don't take me. Um, like I'm working on an environmental history of the Gulag right now, looking at the environmental like legacies of the colonization by forced labor of much of the Arctic and the Soviet Union. And also, starting to look at a visual history. This takes me close to you, David. Visual history of the Hope 1991 sled dog race,
Right.
being interested in dog mushing myself and also Russian Alaskan, Soviet Alaskan interactions. And so remaining open to just wherever sources take me. I've had interesting conversations with people who participated in the race, like Mary Shields, who's since passed away, Carrie Pearsons, who won the race, John Van Zyl, and others. And so just being open to wherever it takes me and taking it kind of slow, not feeling the whip so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both Tyler, Rebecca, and you too, David. I mean, I think all of us have touched on the fact that, even though a single name may appear on a book, there are many hands and many voices that go into that process. And, from the archivists to the librarians to collaborators and people we sit with for oral history interviews, et cetera. And so I was under this very, very serious misimpression early on in my career that, I would be, the solo researcher hiding out in the archives amid dusty books and everything else. And there's a little bit of that, but you're still relying on that archivist to find you those dusty books and those dusty records. You're still relying on a copy editor to help you out at the end of the process. You're still relying on friends and colleagues to bounce ideas off of. And so, I guess my corrective was that, history is a far more collaborative discipline than I certainly would have thought going into the profession. And I think I've really come to embrace that actually. And so, as I craft my future projects now, I'm kind of in this space where I'm very much so interested in hearing from different voices and talking again, particularly in Alaska history, talking to people who have experienced, in many cases, basically the entire sweep of Alaska statehood, right? I mean, these are our friends and our neighbors, and they have incredible stories to tell. And so I think there's just such an opportunity to write Alaska's history in a way that, kind of delivers it to a broader audience, but also provides a first draft. And to Tyler's point, I liked how he said a history and not the history. That was a subtitle in the Black Lives in Alaska, A History of African Americans in the Far Northwest. I think that's key. I mean, none of us have the definitive answers, the definitive history. And anytime I've been confronted with someone who comes up to me, and this has actually happened a lot, it's like, oh, how come I wasn't included in this book? Or how come you didn't tell this story or that story? My response is always, go write your own book. I mean, I don't mean to be so flippant, but very seriously, I mean, like the beauty of what we're doing is that, there is an opportunity to add to our knowledge. And so I would just encourage people to think seriously about the histories that they want to bring forward and connect with people and consider writing a book on your own. So there's my plug for Book Week.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think the biggest like lesson, development, and I imagine all of you all is just, I mean, there's this funny balance, between being humble, and I think, like as you get older, you find out what you don't know, because especially when you're going into, like most people in Alaska, you go into some particular, like area and nobody's done stuff, or people who have done stuff, in a completely different century. And so you get all like, oh my God, like, do people know this? And you just like, oh, you get all excited about like, um, I don't know how to, like, you just kind of, da, 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 I don't know. I'm not very, articulate, but because and I've met like young like graduate students who have the same idea, like, oh my gosh, I'm discovering all these things, I'm gonna like write it out and everybody will know. And and then yeah, and you just get tempered, and where you're more realizing that you need to like be a little more careful with your work. And then especially like working with, again, there's that big power imbalance, like with, like being, white historians, and you're, talking to Native people, and there's just that um, real historical power imbalance where it's really easy to just be like, oh yeah, 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 I got it. And, and not to take the time to actually, like listen. Um, and again, there's always that balance too, because you can be so like holding back so much that it doesn't get done. There has to be some balance there of humility, and you know, if I don't do it, it won't happen. Yeah. Anyway, so just like that wisdom that comes with like being a little bit older, and uh yeah, and having a little bit more of that balance.
Yeah, I got into the project never thinking I'd make $1 million, and I certainly did not. I was motivated because I thought it was an important story to be told and to be documented. And so I feel a sense of accomplishment with my particular project, that it's out there, as painful as it was. And as Ian said, I don't know how many people read the book, but it's out there for future folks who will want to know something about the era that I try to describe. So I think we've reached our. Oh, go ahead, Ian.
I was going to say, I'm reading it now.
Oh, okay, great. Hey, there's one. So I think we've reached the hour of our time here. Thanks to everybody for participating in this. I hope it's helpful to future book writers who want to write about history. So thanks to everybody for participating, and we'll call it a day.
Yeah, thanks.